Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es Toraso Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah. Okay, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. So we are continuing our journey into very difficult times that our people endured. As we said, when we learn the history, we're really gaining perspective on what we've been through, on where we're going, on what lessons we can learn, and how very, very applicable it is, which of course it is. I also would like to begin, at one point I said I was doing this and I kept forgetting, but I really want to end the class with a law or two. I thought we could just go very, very slowly through the laws of the Sabbath, of the Shabbos. Of course, the laws are numerous, so however well you keep it, you can always relearn, and however little you know, you can always learn. So let's remind ourselves what we were doing here. So we are discussing the idea of the Roman conquest of the Jewish people. And we said it really wasn't a conquest, it was really a walk-in. It was really an invite. And if you remember, we had these two warring brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, who had for 5 years been fighting a civil war. Hyrcanus had been allied with the Arab king. He had the backing of Antipater Haedomi. And with that money and that army, he was marching on Aristobulus, who was supported by the people because they were so furious that Hyrcanus had taken this foreign army to fight them. And Aristobulus and his people were in Jerusalem. Hyrcanus and the Arab army was outside Jerusalem, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought. And we said for 5 years, neither could win. A lot of loss of life, a lot of loss of resources, a lot of starvation, but neither won. And finally, after 5 years, we said at the point, it was very obvious, and I'm going to repeat this point because I think sometimes things that are significant, it's worth repeating. For 5 years, this was continuing as the Jews in Jerusalem, the Jews who are very, very, very hungry, have very, very little food. And yet, every day they offer the daily sacrifices. How do they get animals in a besieged Jerusalem? We said the soldiers from Hyrcanus' army were lowering them down over all the barricades, in return of which they got a lot of money from the priests of the temple. But the soldiers in Hyrcanus' army, the Jewish soldiers, also knew that there's an importance in keeping up the work of the temple, and for 5 years that continued. And if you look there, if you were living during those 5 years, not you, but someone might be criticizing and saying, this doesn't make any sense. We need this gold and silver to fight, to get resources, to get ammunition. Why are we wasting it on goats, sheep? Well, what are we doing this for? Bulls? We can't afford this, and we're starving. They're sending animals for us to burn to God every day. Doesn't he want the food to go to his people? But the Jews didn't say that. And for 5 years, that's what happened until, as we said, Hyrcanus' advisor said, you know what? Maybe they're holding out all these years because they keep offering the sacrifices. We better stop it. And that day that they decided to stop it, instead of lowering a goat or a sheep, they lowered a pig. And that was the end of the sacrifices. Obviously, pigs cannot be offered on the altar. Only kosher animals can be offered on the altar. So the pig was like the slap in their face. We're done with you. And right after that is when the brothers had this fatal idea of, we're never going to win. Let's just go to Pompey, go to this new strong Roman general that just conquered Syria, and ask him to resolve our dispute, which was the open invitation Rome took as an invitation of let Rome walk in and take over. Let's walk in and take over. So we really see here so clearly, and I know we mentioned it before, but I think it's such a powerful lesson because very often in our lives, we're like, I could do God's thing, or I could just be more, it could be more, what makes sense, more what I should do, more what makes sense for me, what makes sense practically. And when you do God's thing, you think, oh my gosh, I'm this big hero here. I'm being so amazing that I'm really doing what God wants instead of what's more convenient, more cost effective. And it doesn't work that way at all. For those 5 years when the Jews were offering the sacrifices, which is crazy, an enormous self-sacrifice, because they were very, very hungry themselves and they were burning every day at least 2 animals daily to God, they were saving their country. Not just their side, they were saving the whole country. And when that stopped, we're done. You're given over to the Romans. So sometimes we do things and we feel like, here am I being the great saint, here am I being, so great and amazing and good and godly and so good for God. God's so lucky as someone as good as me serving him. And it comes right back to us. Everything we do for God is such a way to help ourselves, not only spiritually, which of course we all understand, but in our most physical lives as well. So the Romans walked in. At the end of last class, we were discussing a bit the whole history of Rome, going all the way back to the very beginning of its settlement, which was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before this moment in time. Because our sages see a link. They see a parallelism, which again also I thought was very, very strong point. Our sages draw a parallelism between the spiritual decline of the Jews and the rise of Rome. The spiritual decline of the Jews and the rise of Rome. The spiritual decline of the Jews and the rise of Rome. Now, it didn't happen overnight, and the Romans didn't overnight have the power to attack us, and even when they attacked us and conquered us, it still took a while until they tried to destroy us in a very, very vicious way. It took a while. As did the spiritual decline take a while. But each time again, and again, I think the very strong lesson we see from this, and it's so clear, is everything has a reaction. Every action has a reaction. Everything we do has a consequence. And sometimes we see it, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes, as in this case, people do wrong and don't see God's response. And of course, sometimes we do right and we don't see God's response. But every action has a reaction. Every time we do right, God is responding. As our sages say, God never is indebted to us. Every good thing we do, he always responds. And if, God forbid, we do something wrong, there's always a response as well. We might not see it right away. It took hundreds and hundreds of years for this gradual rising of Rome, as step by step, the Jews do something else significantly wrong, and there's another step in the rise of Rome.
What if, how, if you're doing wrong and it's Hashem's plan, right? He wants you to do that because he knows later on down the road you're going to have a better connection to him or a better relationship. So then why would you be punished for, let's say, the Averos you're doing if it's really going to bring you closer to him?
Because his plan doesn't take away your free choice. It really works the opposite. Since God controls everything, if you ever do anything wrong, we have to philosophically understand this is also part of his plan. Because if it wasn't part of his plan, how did it happen? How could something happen that's not what God wants? So we don't, just for our own brain's sake, we're not going to usually view it as starting from him. We're going to view it as starting from you. God never forces you to sin, God forbid. You make bad choices. Maybe it's a setup. Maybe there's lots of pressures on you to make a bad choice. Maybe there's lots of temptations on you to make a bad choice. And sometimes, of course, not. But even when there's lots of pressures and lots of temptations, God never takes away our free choice, which means the same way we could mess up, we could be strong and God will help us and we will overcome this. But if we do mess up, we know that's also part of the master plan. And we know exactly, as you said, Froma, God is allowing us. That's how we would view it. God is allowing us to make this bad choice because he knows of the tremendously greater relationship we will have with him when we return after our downslide. So the downslide is part of our upward movement, getting actually closer and closer and closer to God. But it only, so to speak, from our brain's sake at least, to make it simple for us, starts with our bad choices. Now, does it mean God always punishes us? What God wants here is our repentance. If we repent, there's not going to be punishment. But there's always a consequence. The consequence could be a spiritual consequence, it could be a physical consequence. But if a person completely repents, there's not going to be punishment. But then that repentance was the desired consequence of the sin. Any other questions? Okay. So what did the sages set up as a parallelism? So we did say this last week, but I'll just repeat it briefly again. I know we said it last week, but I just thought it was a very, very powerful concept. That they said that says when King Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh, the divine emissary, the angel Gabriel, descended and put a reed in the sea, which silt gathered upon, from which was built what became eventually Rome. So we're going all the way back to King Solomon. We are almost 1,000 years after King Solomon at this point. Not exactly, but almost 1,000 years. Almost about 900 years, to be precise, later. 850 at this point. And yet, some 850 years ago, an action of King Solomon was the beginning of what's going to become the Rome that's going to destroy the Jews, or attempt to destroy the Jews. God never lets us be destroyed. Some 900 years later. We said the next step in it was the founding of Rome. And according to the Romans, their founding matches according to what was happening in Jewish history at that time, when King Asa had the opportunity to reunite the split two nations of the Jewish people and failed to do so, as I know we discussed at length last week. So King Asa, who was not uniting the tribes, not uniting the two countries to become one again, to become merged. And there we have Rome being founded. According to the Roman legend, exactly the time when Rome was founded. Going a bit further in our Jewish history, when Manasseh, who was a king that brought idolatry and practiced, unfortunately, what we would call murder, as he was bringing idolatry to the land and murdering in a way that created a tremendous evil, that's what allowed, at that same time in Rome, them to drive out their Etruscan overlords and establish their own independent Roman colony. So Rome becomes independent, as in Israel, which of course has been settled for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, there's a tremendous decline with idolatry and murder. And so it continued and continued and continued. The same time when the Septuagint was commissioned, when the Jews, unfortunately, again, this was not the desire of the Jews, but when those 70 sages had to go under the decree of the Egyptian ruler at that time, I'm sure you remember this concept, we definitely discussed it at length. That's when Rome is consolidating its rule over the whole Italian peninsula and is beginning to look outwards. So by the 2nd century BCE, Rome has become a powerful enough player on the scene to be in competition with the other big world powers. At that time, there wasn't one world power, there was 3. We had the Seleucid Greeks, who we were dealing with. That was the story of Hanukkah. We had the Ptolemaic Egyptians, who we have been under before the Seleucidians, and that was when the Septuagint was commissioned. And now we have the new kid on the block, the Roman Republic. And again, you might remember or not, I mentioned it, I think also last week, how Judah, the Maccabee, Yehuda, actually turned to this new rising star to see if he could get their help in fighting the Seleucidians. I mean, they didn't give him any help then. But they were just sort of like this new, very new, fresh, young power that was rising. And at that time, it was actually to our advantage. Because here we had the Seleucidians, who were the Assyrians that were, you know, trying to conquer us. And God sometimes used this Roman force to like keep them at check. So we were able actually to escape the Seleucidian conquest. So in the beginning, again, as I'm saying, the Romans, this new kid on the block, this new power, it was between the Ptolemaic Egyptians, the Seleucidian Greeks, and the Romans, and we're in the middle of the fray, and sometimes that's how we got under the Ptolemaics, that's how we got under the Seleucidians, and the Romans were a little bit of a fringe, so they didn't in any way harm us. They didn't in any way actually engage in us until this point now. Until when Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, those two brothers that were in civil war for 5 years after their righteous mother passed away, Shlomzion, they invited, in essence, Pompey, if you've heard of Pompey, this great, renowned Greek general who had just conquered the Assyrians, and they invited him to settle their dispute, which he took as an invitation to walk in and take over the land. Now, as we discussed last week, Pompey basically marched in. The Jews in Jerusalem were like, what? We just fought for 5 years for freedom to now be given over to Rome? No way. But we said it took a few months they were able to withstand Hyrcanus's army for 5 years. But the Pompey's army, the Roman army, that was the top army of the world at this time, they were run over quickly with the loss of life, with the murder of many, 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 many Jews once the Romans were able to, break through the barriers of fortresses around Jerusalem and conquer the city. So that's what happened then under Pompey. Now, when Pompey goes back to Rome, none of these people had an easy life. And as we've seen already in the past, rise to power, death, murder, deposed by someone else. I mean, we've seen this in all of our journeying in the Jewish history, and we've seen, of course, on a far greater degree in the world happening. What was happening in the Jewish world was a pale comparison to what was going on in the secular arena at that time, and that was really what happened with Pompey. So Pompey starts off conquering Israel, and we said he wasn't really oppressive of us. He didn't really care what the Jews were doing spiritually as long as they paid their taxes, because that was basically what the Roman Empire wanted. At that time, it was still the Roman Republic. They all they wanted was to conquer more, to get more vassal states, to get more money, to support the incredibly indulgent lives of all the Roman nobles. So that's what he wanted from us. We paid our taxes. He couldn't care less. I mean, that unfortunately did not last too long, but that's how it started off. So Pompey goes back to Rome. When he comes back to Rome, he allies himself with someone that the world knows. At that time, his name was Crassus, but he became known ultimately as Julius Caesar. So he and Julius Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, the three of them formed the first Roman triumvirate. These three people that are ruling what we're calling still the Republic of Rome. That alliance lasts for about a decade until Julius Caesar comes back. He had won a lot of wars. He had a very powerful army. So he marches on Rome to take it all for himself. What should I be ruling with two other people for? I want to be the sole ruler. And when that happened, Pompey runs away. He's defeated by Julius. He has an army. He has a rebellion. He loses. He runs to Egypt, and he's murdered by Ptolemy. Julius Caesar becomes the Caesar. He has all this power. Guess what? He's assassinated as he walks into the Senate. Who was he assassinated by? A number of people that ultimately themselves. Cassius. I don't know if you know these names from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We have Cassius and we have Brutus. Brutus is defeated in a very big battle, which Brutus and Cassius lost. And then Cassius suicides after the battle. So Julius Caesar's assassins quickly die themselves. Ptolemy of Egypt, who assassinated Pompey when he ran to Egypt for protection, he was himself drowned in the Nile. Why am I going into this? What do we care? I think first of all, I wanted to bring out the upheavals in Rome, as we're going, which actually did not stop the forces in Judea from violating again and again and again our land. But I also want to bring out this point of something actually that Hillel, the elder, says in Ethics of the Fathers. It says that Hillel was of course a great sage, a great tzaddik, very renowned. It says that Hillel was once walking by the water and he saw a skull floating in the water. And he said to it, oh, because you drowned others, you were drowned, and those that drowned you will also be drowned. And there are many, many levels of interpreting that. And on the most, if you will, simple level, that skull was a skull of Pharaoh of Egypt, the Pharaoh of the Jews' journey in Egypt. And Hillel is saying to that skull, to Pharaoh, well, guess what? You were drowned. Because what did you do to the Jews? You know, what did you do to all those babies, all those children? You drowned them. So God drowned you, but those that drowned you will also be drowned. And we see this so vividly in this history of Rome, this cycle and cycle and cycle of brutality, of assassination, of murder, of seizing power and power being seized and losing and gaining and violence. And we just see again and again and again that those that are seizing the power is seized from them. Those that are murdering are murdered. And so it continues and continues and continues because, again, going back to what we were saying before, we don't always have the eyes to see it. It's very easy to see it when I just said it, many years and, a minute or two. We're talking about many years over which these things happened. The triumvirate lasted for 10 years before they fought among themselves. There's going to be another triumvirate that's going to last for another 10 years till they fight among themselves. These things take a little longer as it plays out in God's timeline than am I giving it over. But in the end of the day, you can so clearly see, because you drowned others, you were drowned. And those that drowned you will be drowned. And so it is always true. And for us, as the innocent good people of the world, obviously everyone on this class is in that category. So for us, as the innocents, as the good, as the righteous people, we should always know that. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes our eyes can't see it. And we're like, why? Why do these people have such power when these people are doing such horrible things? God says, trust me. I know better than you what they're doing, and I know better than you how they will be repaid.
Is it just for people in power, or is it, let's say, one person who's hurting another person?
It's always true, but when one person is hurting another person, we don't see it in as big time, and therefore we might also not see the consequence as big time. But everything, as I said, every action has a reaction. Every time if someone does something, there's a consequence. And if someone's hurting someone, they will be paid back. We might or might not see it, just like, the famous story of Titus. Titus was ultimately the destroyer of the Second Temple and a tremendous blasphemer of God. And what God did, of course, our sages say that after Titus died, God continued to punish him, which is rather unusual for a Gentile. But what it says in the Talmud is God said, really? Like, you think you're so powerful, you're more powerful than God? I have a tiny little creature that I'll use to exact punishment for. And he had a tiny little flea. What's a flea? With Titus, the world conqueror, the world emperor, the power, vicious, violent. He had this little flea bore a hole in his ear and get right by the eardrum. And until Titus died, this flea was gnawing away and eating away from his brain. It says when he ultimately died, they saw it was this massive hole and this massive creature inside his brain. It started off as a little flea that was pounding at him for the rest of his life. If you would see him up there with his royal robes, with all of his arrogance, with all of his brutality, you have no clue how God is at this very moment exacting judgment and suffering. So we can't always see it, but we know that God keeps his words. Because you drowned others, you were drowned. And those that drown you will drown. And if someone does evil, it comes back at them. And if someone does good, it comes back at them. When you put good out, the good comes back at you. The more, and it's sort of like, I don't know, like a simple example. You're driving and someone's trying to switch lanes. And you allow them to get in front of you. It happens to us all the time, right? Does that person know your name? No. Do you expect that person to ever repay you the favor? No. But you put out good, good comes back to you. That's how God works in his world. And when someone puts out negative energy, that's what comes back to them. That's how God works in his world. So, the saga of Rome continues. So we had this battle where Brutus was killed and Cassius suicided. Those were the murderers of Julius Caesar, how God, so to speak, the evil they put out came back at them. This was this battle going on, all these intrigues among the Romans themselves. So the victors of the battle were 3 Romans. One, of course, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. So they also form a triumvirate, and it also lasts about a decade. And then they also fall back into a civil war and are bashing at each other, and most of them die. Octavian comes away the victor. He becomes a Caesar himself, Caesar Augustus. And so it continued, and so it continued, and so it continued. But what's happening in Judea at this point? What's happening is a very evil person that created, in essence, the seed of this whole plot, who's still at it. Of course, we know his name, Antipater Ha'adomi, right? If you remember, Antipater Ha'adomi, he was originally this Edomite, which means he was forcibly converted, or his ancestors, probably his grandparents, were forcibly converted. He had a lot of money, we said, a lot of political skill. He had been appointed the governor over this Edomi territory because he convinced the king Yanai that they should be ruled by their own. After Shlom Tzion passed away, he was the one that allied himself with Hyrcanus, and he was the start of the whole rebellion. Again, if it hadn't been for him, Hyrcanus would have stayed the high priest, Aristobulus would have been the king, and who knows what would have happened. But obviously this is what God wanted to happen, because this is what happened. So Antipater Ha'adomi was the one that egged on Hyrcanus, that got this alliance with the Arab king, was the one that got Hyrcanus probably to go with Aristobulus to Pompeii. So all these intrigues, what usually happens is you ally yourself with whoever's in power. And when he goes down, all of his friends go down. So they all get murdered also, or they all lose all their power. Right? As we're saying, all these things are happening. First, Pompey has power. Pompey goes to Rome. He becomes part of the triumvirate. And that lasts about a decade, and then it falls apart. And he fights them, and he loses Julius Caesar. He runs away. He gets murdered in Egypt, and then Julius Caesar himself gets assassinated, and then Brutus and Cassius. All these things are happening, and guess what? Each time Antipater Ha'adomi manages to connect to the person in power. Pompey's in power, he's Pompey's friend. Pompey loses it, no problems, he's close with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar loses, no problems, he's with Brutus. Brutus and Cassius lose it, no problem. And so he continued, like a cat with 9 lives. He got close enough to the top that he should have fallen with the top, but he never fell. He, with all of his guile and cunning, and obviously what God wanted, he kept on gaining power, and no matter what was happening in Rome, and no matter the person fell, and then the next person fell, and then the next person fell, he kept on allying himself to just gain more and more and more power until he so abused and violated the people that were under him that he himself was assassinated. Which meant then that all of his power and connections and money transferred to his son, Herod, who was one of the most violent and brutal rulers of the Jewish people. Herod inherited not only all of his father's money, not only all of his father's political connections, but all of his father's political skill. So however high Antipater Ha'adomi went with the Romans, Herod was 10 steps more than that. And as we're going to see, the violence and the power and the might that Herod took to rule and harm and brutalize the Jewish people. Now, we said that originally it didn't really bother the Romans, our religious customs. Like, they didn't really care, because that wasn't really their point. Their point was power and money. They have another country under them, they have more power. They have another country under them, they have more money. That was basically all they cared. But as time went on, the Romans became more and more hostile to the Jewish people. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with much later, when the Romans become Christian and really turn against us in the most vicious, violent way possible, We're way, way, way before that time. So at this time, the Romans are pagan idolaters. And as such, they looked at the Jewish people and were really upset with them because they felt they were non-believers. Sounds very ironic. But the Romans have all these gods, and the Jews won't accept any of them. Normally, wherever the Romans went, their culture went, their gods went, and the people, yeah, your gods, my gods, let's share, great. And the Jews are like, we don't want your gods. What do you mean you don't want our gods? This really infuriated them. Also, they just viewed the Jews as really weird, like really different and strange. Because in those days, basically, as the Romans ruled, the term for it was with, and besides, of course, their might, how they lived was with circuses and bread, which means to keep the populace in line, they would entertain them with these gladiator displays, which the Jews had no interest in. The ultimate thing, what you did to give the people that were gaining power, this was like the how we reward those that are serving us, is they would make these massive feasts, these tremendous orgies of indulgence on many levels. The Jews had no interest. So the Jews weren't interested in their circuses. The Jews weren't interested in their bread. What the whole world was consuming, oh wow, the circuses of Rome. Oh wow, the bread of Rome. The Jews didn't care about the circuses, and the Jews didn't care about the bread. And in the beginning, the Romans didn't care either, but after a while, it started to irk them. Why don't you want to participate in our circuses? The whole world loves these gladiator displays. What's your problem? Why aren't you wanting our bread? Why aren't you wanting to join us for our huge, massive feasts and parties and indulgent displays of everything? We don't do that stuff. Why not? So as time went on, they were more and more annoyed. They were more and more bothered. They more and more disliked the Jews because the Jews were different. The Jews didn't blend, which of course we see historically over all the generations. We've always seen this. We come to a place and we don't blend. If we want to come all the way to modern times to America, America's the melting pot, and the Jews didn't melt. We just didn't melt in the melting pot. We might not have become religious, but we didn't melt. We might have lost our religion, but we still didn't melt. A Jew is different. A Jew is just different. A Jew's not melting. And that was very, very, very annoying. If it's to America, if it's to the Romans, it's the same. Why aren't you blending? Why aren't you melding? Why aren't you becoming like the rest of us? And this started to really bother them. And there's a lot of other things the Jews did they found very strange, weird, and annoying. Circumcision. There was nothing that bothered them more than circumcision. Truth is, I could have asked you, and you might have figured it out yourself, that circumcision would be so, so annoying to them. Why was circumcision so, so, so annoying to them? Because the Romans' perspective was the beauty of the body. To a Roman, the best clothing is nothing. Naked. Absolute nudity. What's more beautiful than a human body? And the commandment of circumcision is saying, modesty. Restrain your passions. Restrain your human urges. Restrain your animalistic drive. The Romans are restrain our animalistic drive? It's awesome. There's nothing better than that. And the Jews are saying, no, there is. There is. We bring godliness to everything. To every part of us, we bring godliness. That was crazy for the Romans. You want to lessen a physical pleasure? You want to cover a human body? You want to decrease the human sensual physical drive? You're crazy. So of all the commandments, what they really couldn't fathom and stand, and what bothered them because it went to the core against their absolute life of hedonism, begin, middle, and end with indulgence, was circumcision. because circumcision is the antithesis of that. And it's very interesting. Of course, that's something that we know is marked on the flesh of a Jew, their insignia of being in God's army, of serving God, of belonging to God. And this was something that so bothered the Romans. So as this continued, as I'm saying, all of these irritations and annoyances and being irked by us and feeling we're weird and different, in other words, we stand for values that they were trashing and violating, and maybe a Jew's modesty was the biggest slap in the face a Roman could get. And a Jew's non-desire of this hedonistic pleasures was the biggest reproof that they did not want to accept. And therefore they started really, really, really hating us. Which was, again, and I'm pointing this out to understand this in the context, not typical for Rome. They weren't like the Assyrian Greeks, whose desire was to go around and convert everyone. It wasn't their mandate, it wasn't their mission. Inevitably, it's what was happening more or less, because they were offering a greater degree of, if you want to call it, culture than the pagans around them, and they were also pagans, of course. Their paganism was maybe more developed than the other people's paganism, so therefore it was more appealing. But they weren't like on a vendetta that everyone has to have our culture. But when they kept on butting heads with the Jewish people, and they found people that are godly, and people that aren't going to melt, and aren't going to blend, and aren't going to give up values far higher than the Romans could fathom, this really, really bothered them. Now again, they didn't start off being as vicious as they became. Everything happens gradually. So they started off by creating something that we've seen historically many, many times since, a Jewish tax, right? There were Jewish taxes throughout the medieval times, throughout the Middle Ages, in the Holocaust. I mean, you know, this is the same tools, the same tricks, the same techniques from the beginning of time till now. Everyone always goes back to the same tools. So the Romans initiated it. If you ever heard of a Jewish tax, the Romans were the first ones to do it. Why did they start this Jewish tax? Not for need of our money. Of course, they wanted our money, but they already were taxing us as a country, as a vassal state. So they already were getting our money. This tax, it was a small tax, with a very deliberate goal. The tax was to support their god Jupiter. What was the point of the tax? Because they wanted to create a situation that we were, so to speak, part of their idolatrous culture. Because now we're serving Jupiter, because we're giving Jupiter our money. This tax was started by Vespasian. It was, you know, part of course, the conquerors of the temple. He created the law. The law was very severely enforced by his son. And it was a very degrading law. Again, it wasn't as much the financial damage as the degradation and the concept of, I'm going to get you to serve an idol. I'm going to get you. If we're going to make a law that's going to force you to do it, we're going to get you to serve our idols. And when the Jews, again, just still wouldn't blend, still wouldn't melt, still wouldn't become part of this pagan hedonistic society, in the end, the vengeance of Rome came on us in a way that was far more aggressive than all of our three previous conquerors combined. Meaning everything the Babylonians did to us, everything the Persians did to us, and everything the Greeks did to us, all together was far less than what the Romans did to us. Our sages connect the Romans to a verse. The verse says in the Torah, it says, God's going to bring upon you a nation from afar, from the ends of the earth, swooping down like an eagle. This nation's language you will not understand, meaning it's completely foreign to you. An arrogant nation with no respect for the old and no compassion for the young. So the armies that march under the Roman standard, which was the eagle, the sages felt was a fulfillment of this verse. This nation from afar, Jews never had any connection with at all, wasn't part of all their ancient dealings. This new nation on the scene, under the eagle, that was the most cruel nation we ever dealt with. And of course, on a spiritual level, we say this nation is a descendant of Esav, of Edom. So going all the way back to Isaac and his sons. We had Jacob, and we have Esav. We have Esav with his absolute eternal hatred of the Jewish people. Rome became the next incarnation, or the next manifestation of the energies of Esav, the energies of Edom, the energies of Rome. Any questions at this point? Okay, so let's focus now on Herod. Not a fun topic. Let's focus on Herod. So Herod, from the beginning to the end, his entire career was marked by enormous, enormous violence. So we said he was the son of a Tiptar Hadomi, who had tremendous investment in the dissolution of the Jewish state. And Herod continued in his father's example and far, far surpassed it. So the first Roman general over the Jews was Pompey. After Pompey, the next one was Gabinius. And what he did was he abolished the Sanhedrin. Now, when Gabinius abolished the Sanhedrin was the court of 71 sages, the ultimate Torah governing central body the Jews had. And that's why Gabinius abolished it. Again, at that point, the Romans don't yet care about us in our religious beliefs. He didn't abolish it to harm Judaism. He couldn't care less about Judaism. He abolished it because he understood correctly that it was like the real power, the real, if we will call it political, central power the Jews had. The sages of the 71 Council Sanhedrin were the ruling authority the Jews recognized, because the Jews, the high majority of Jews, were faithful to God. And as such, at this point, the people they listened to were the Sanhedrin. And what the Sanhedrin said, the people did. Meaning, we still have those fringe tzedukim. Remember the idea of the tzedukim? The people that were, like, if you will, assimilated and not listening to God, but that was a very small minority. And it became far smaller after the whole Hashmona'i palace party dynasty is basically almost gone completely. They're still around. We're going to still encounter them. But they weren't a very big percentage at any time, and how much less now. So the vast majority of the Jews were very loyal to God. And as such, who were they listening to? The puppet king Hyrcanus, the one who had been fighting them for 5 years, and then went and brought Pompey and the Roman Empire on their backs? To the people, he was a nothing, a nobody. So who are the people taking their cues from? The Romans? Antiptar Hadomi? Who they listened to were the sages. And the central body of the sages was the Sanhedrin. And Gabinius realized this, that this is the real power. And therefore he dissolved it. He didn't execute the sages. He just dissolved it and said there could no longer be this central authority, because he didn't want anyone to have authority besides Rome. And unfortunately, he was right, meaning when he dissolved the Sanhedrin, and it had to become a more covert organization, it removed from the Jews a central Torah authority, which is very, very significant, as we're going to see later in history, that created ultimately the very tragic rebellion that caused the destruction of the temple and an enormous catastrophe of Jewish life. So because the Sanhedrin did not have this central power, they weren't able to keep the people in check. They weren't able to guide the people, and a lot of factions developed that caused tremendous, 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 tremendous harm, enormous, enormous harm. So besides Gabinius doing that, there's something else he did. And again, he did it in a very calculated way to weaken the people. to make sure that the people would not be able to rebel against them. So what he did was he took the land of Judea, calling the Jewish land, and he divided it into 5 separate provinces. So each place is now is not one country, it's 5 little countries. And as such, his thought was that each place, not going to have so much to do with the other place, or each going to be ruled separately by their own little appointee by the Romans. And therefore, they would never be able to really unite and have the power to rebel. Which was and wasn't true. Like, in a sense, the fact that they were split up this way actually, in a sense, fostered more revolution against the Romans, which didn't help us at all, actually harmed us. but in a sense, it sort of did that, because again, now that the Jews are very fragmented, they're less and less under the central authority of the sages, and the sages had no desire to cause rebellion against Rome. They understood a rebellion against Rome would just mean a catastrophe for the Jews, would just mean a decimation of Jewish life. For what purpose? How in the world could we ever conquer? And we're not conquer. How in the world could we ever become independent from Rome? If it's meant to be, God's going to just cause the Roman Empire to fall apart, and that's when it's going to happen. But it's not going to happen from our hands, which of course is ultimately what happened many, many centuries later. But at this point, the rebellion factions had more and more power because there was no Sanhedrin to keep them centrally localized, listening to the sages. And because the Jews were fragmented into these 5 separate areas, rebellions were sort of breeding in these separate areas, again, without having this one country under the sages to stay loyal to God, and therefore not to rebel, not to just cause the decimation of Jewish life. So Herod, this is still under the time of his father, is appointed the governor over the northern province of these 5 provinces. This is his first step to power. His father's still around. Herod, is the great heir and successor. So Antipter, because we said Antipter has a lot of connections, and the Romans divided this into 5 areas, and they were putting like a governor over each area. Antipter got his son Herod as the governor. What's Herod's first act? So of course it was always dissent. There were always people that were not happy with the Romans, as I'm sure nobody was really happy with the Romans. Herod right away says, oh, there's rebellion here. He was trying to gain brownie points with Rome, and he couldn't care less about Jewish lives. So he begins his career. He's appointed the governor over this northern province in the Galilee by murdering out all these Jews that he claimed were plotting a rebellion or were rebellious or whatever. Who cares? Obviously, there was no court and there was no proof and there was nothing. It was all just a ploy so Herod could go back to his Roman overlords and say, look how loyal I am to you. I just murdered so many Jews that were thinking rebellion against you. This is how he started his career. And this of course caused the Jews to be so upset by him and so horrified. But there's no Sanhedrin. If there was a Sanhedrin, if we had these governing 71 sages, they could have perhaps done something to him. But the Sanhedrin had lost their power. The Sanhedrin had been dissolved by the Romans. There's no official Sanhedrin anymore. So at this point, the people went to Hyrcanus. Remember, Hyrcanus is that puppet king. According to the Romans, he's still officially king. Practically, of course, he has no power, never had any power, and was a complete puppet. And he's good friends, so to speak, with Antipter. But the people are saying, look what Herod did. He was appointed the ruler, and he just started murdering people. It's not like these people were rebelling. He just made an excuse and claimed they were rebelling, so he could murder and claim it's for the sake of rebellion. It wasn't for the sake of rebellion. It was for the sake of telling Rome that he's such a great ruler. He's already murdering the rebels before they're even rebels. You've got to do something. Now again, Hyrcanus' backbone was about non-existent. So Hyrcanus has no desire to start up with Herod. No desire at all to step on his toes. But of course, he didn't know what to do to say to the Jews. So he like sort of is playing it on both ends. He gathers this like tribunal of sages. He calls Herod in for an accounting. What did he do? Nobody was rebelling. Herod takes governing of the Galil, and he claims people are rebelling so he can have an opportunity to murder people, so he can have an opportunity to tell Rome he's so loyal to them he killed out the rebels that didn't even exist yet. What's he doing? He's murdering people without any reason. Hyrcanus is officially the king over these people. You're murdering my subjects. They didn't do anything wrong. So something very interesting happened. And I think we'll stop at this point, but just interesting because, again, it goes to show you a very powerful lesson. Herod could have just ignored Hyrcanus, and Hyrcanus would have done nothing and had no power to do anything and had no desire to do anything. Because, again, Hyrcanus was terrified of Herod, as Herod and Hyrcanus both knew. But instead, Herod, he couldn't care less. He came into this court against him. He came in dressed in all of his royal clothing. He came in surrounded by his soldiers. And he's sort of like, yeah, like, you had something to tell me? Very interesting. What happened? I think it's a very interesting point. I will end on this point. Everyone was terrified. Here were the sages. They were loyal sages. They were good sages. But they were terrified. How could they open their mouth up against Herod? They knew it was pointless. They knew anything they would say would be irrelevant. They knew Hyrcanus was going to do. Hyrcanus, the wimp, was going to do nothing against Herod, the violent, and the son of Antiptar, Hyrcanus' backbone. So they just sort of squashed down. Hyrcanus, of course, did nothing. I mean, he didn't want to do anything in the first place. And what happened? One sage got up. His name was Shammai. If you've heard of Hillel and Shammai, that dynamic duo, Hillel was not part of this gathering. Shammai was. Shammai stood up. And you know what Shammai said to the people? He said, forget about Herod. Herod is irrelevant. Herod's not the point here. Herod couldn't care less about our laws. We're going to complain to Herod for murdering. Herod cares about murdering. We're going to tell Herod he's breaking the laws. He's officially a Jew and he's breaking the laws, so we the sages are judging him. He couldn't care less about the laws. But you know who I want to talk to? You know who I'm complaining against? I'm complaining against you. I'm complaining against this king, Hyrcanus. I'm complaining against these sages here. And you should know it's going to come back to bite you. You should know because you're scared, because you're not trusting in God, who's far bigger than Herod, it's going to come back in your face. And this king who's protecting Herod, Herod's going to kill him. And these sages, it's all going to come back right at you. This Herod that you're going to dismiss, that you're not willing to punish, he's going to come back and destroy the king and destroy all of you. Very, very strong, proud words. And very interesting. So what happened? I'm going to say this quickly because towards the end, but I just think it's an amazing point to end on. So when the sages heard this, they were like, oh my gosh, of course he's right. What are we scared of this human being, this flesh and blood? We're the sages. We have to do what God said. He's a murderer. So of course they immediately pronounced his death sentence. And that night, Hyrcanus, the king that officially called Herod to judgment, helped Herod escape, got Herod out and away from their control. He ran away. He ran out of Israel for a while. Because of course Hyrcanus was terrified that, God forbid, the sages should fulfill their decree and execute Herod. I'm going to fast forward a few years, but I just want to bring, Herod's saga continues, but I just want to bring this point. What happened a few years later, again, I'm not going through all the details, we can do that next week. Herod comes back and eventually murders Hyrcanus and murders all those sages. Who was the one sage who he didn't touch? Shammai. The only sage he didn't touch was Shammai. Very interesting. Now again, Herod didn't say, I'm not touching Shammai because Shammai was the only one that had the guts to stand up against me. The official reason Herod didn't touch Shammai was because Shammai was so beloved by the people. You know, it's interesting because from our perspective, we think, oh, Hillel was the one everyone loved and Shammai was like a little bit, tough. I didn't think he was. But he was so beloved by the people that Herod was too scared to start up with him. But if it was because Shammai had the guts to stand up to him, if it was because he was so beloved by the people. The bottom line is exactly as Shammai said, that's exactly what happened. When you give in to evil, when you're scared of evil, when you nullify yourselves to evil, you're just giving it a power over you. Maybe the power is today, maybe the power is later. Hyrcanus was terrified of Herod. Hyrcanus gets murdered by Herod. These sages that, again, they didn't sin. They did get back their backbone. They did say he was supposed to be killed. He didn't die then and save a lot of Jewish lives because of Hyrcanus. But the sages who temporarily had crumpled there, Herod murdered every one of them, besides Shammai. For whatever his reasons were besides Shammai, obviously we understand why God would not allow Shammai to be murdered by Herod, because Shammai stood up to Herod. And I think it just, again, reaffirms exactly the message I said earlier. It's such a strong, strong, strong message that when we have history to look at it, we can see it so strongly, this point that when you're scared of evil, evil has power over you. Maybe today or maybe tomorrow or maybe in a few tomorrows. But when you feed it, when you give into it, when you think you're going to protect yourself by not starting up with it, you're only giving it room to aggrandize itself and take you over. And when you refuse to give in to the evil, when you stand up to the evil, when you're strong and not going to give into it, it can't touch you. It can't touch you. The irony of the situation. The only sage that Herod didn't kill was the sage with the biggest mouth against him. The sage with the mouth against him. Shammai was the sage that stood up to him. Shammai was the sage Herod couldn't touch. So I think it's such a strong lesson for us if sometimes we're intimidated. If sometimes we feel like there are a lot of forces that we should just sort of like comply with and not start up with, not try to whatever. We should understand when you try to make peace with evil, you're only giving it power over you. And when you refuse, when you're strong and confident and proud with God's power, evil can't touch you. So we're going to stop at this point. It is a little late. Maybe I'll just do one law, but I did want to start doing some of the laws of the Shabbos. So just to start off with this idea, we are supposed to honor the Shabbos. How do we honor the Shabbos? It says we're supposed to wear special clothing for Shabbos. At the least, they should be clean clothing. If possible, they should be special Shabbos clothing. They should be more beautiful than our regular clothing. We're supposed to delight in the Shabbos. On a physical level, have delight, which is through special foods and drinks, special higher level food and drink, each place according to its custom. But the custom became among the Jewish people that the food that marks the honor of the Shabbos is meat, and the drink that marks the honor of the Shabbos is wine. Because most people seem to view those high-level delicacy foods. So therefore, a person should add in meats and wine as much as they can. What if a person's poor and doesn't have money? So we're told, I'll just say this briefly, concept, we're told that you don't have to borrow money to have these extra special delicious foods for Shabbos. But if you do borrow money, God will repay. And we're told actually in general by the sages that all of our money is determined on Rosh Hashanah, except the money we spend on the foods for Shabbos and the holidays. Meaning, let's say God gave you a budget of, I don't know, 50,000, 100,000, whatever it is. That's your annual budget. That's what he's going to give you over the year. But that does not include the money you spend on Shabbos and the holidays. The money you spend then, that's bonus money. God's going to pay you back separately for all the money you spend to beautify and honor his Sabbath and his holidays. And therefore, even though generally we're cautioned that we can't live beyond our means, but we're told if it's food for Sabbath or for the holidays, or wine for Sabbath or holidays, you can borrow money for it, meaning you can borrow to have the money to buy these foods and drinks, And don't worry, God will be the guarantor. God will pay you back. So we will end on that point. Thank you so much for joining. It was wonderful to see what an amazing, great turnout we had this week. And you should have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful week. And we should take all these lessons and really apply them and fear no evil, because we're so much more powerful than it. We have the power of God on our side. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.